Hey guys, today's video lecture topic is going to be the cycling of matter or the cycling of nutrients. The cycles we're going to be focusing on are going to be the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the carbon cycle. Please make sure you're filling in your notes organizer as you watch the video. Okay, so we're going to start this video lecture with something a little bit different. I want you to think about Albert Einstein. Now I want you to take in a really deep breath. Do you feel any smarter? Well, you should, because you are actually breathing in the same molecules, the same atoms that Albert Einstein was so many years ago. So, why must nutrients be cycled? Simply speaking, there is a fixed amount of matter and energy that exist in the universe. So to be able to get the nutrients that we need, or to get the atoms and molecules that we need, matter has to take on different forms during different processes so that it can continue to go around and around. So why in the world are we talking about this in a life science class like biology? Well, let's just review. What are the building blocks of life? We know that's cells. What are the building blocks of cells? Those are going to be proteins. Do you remember what the building blocks of proteins are? Those are amino acids. And then what are the building blocks of amino acids? That's going to be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. So in order to be able to build the amino acids that we need to build proteins, to build cells, to be alive, we have to talk about how that matter takes on different forms during the different cycles. Okay, so we're going to start off with the water cycle. This is the one you're most familiar with, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is number 2 in your notes organizer. So the water cycle itself describes the continuous process by which water molecules move from bodies of water, land, and living things on Earth's surface to the atmosphere and then back to the Earth's surface. This is important because nearly 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. Only 1 to 2% of that is available as fresh drinking water for humans. So now we need to talk about the different forms that it can exist in. Okay, so part of the water cycle, you have evaporation, transpiration, condensation, and precipitation. This is 2C on your notes organizer. Evaporation is where you go from liquid to gas. It's the process by which the surface of a liquid absorbs enough energy to change into a gas. Transpiration is simply a type of evaporation that happens in plants. So it's the process by which water is evaporated through a plant's leaves. It goes out through these little holes called stomata. We'll talk about that later, but that is transpiration, the one you're probably least familiar with. Condensation is going from that gas that came from evaporation into a liquid form. This is what happens on the outside of your Coke can when you have the cold inside meeting the warm outside. So this is the process by which a gas changes to a liquid. And then finally, once that condensation gets heavy enough up in the clouds, you have precipitation. So this is the different forms of water that fall back to the Earth's surface. This, of course, can be rain, it can be sleet, hail, snow, depending on what temperature it is. Okay, now I want you to pause the video or go back to another slide if you liked another picture better, and I want you to use the space either below 2D or on the back of your page to just draw a simple water cycle. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. Make sure you label evaporation, transpiration, condensation, and precipitation. Okay, next up we have the nitrogen cycle, and you're probably a little more unfamiliar with this. The reason we talk about the nitrogen cycle is because, believe it or not, about 78 to 80% of the Earth's atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. I think it's a common misconception that air is mostly made up of oxygen, but that's actually really untrue. Most of the air in the atmosphere is nitrogen. But unfortunately, the nitrogen found in the atmosphere, N2, two nitrogen atoms bonded together, is not a usable form for plants and animals. So in order for plants and animals to be able to use the nitrogen that they need to build amino acids, to build proteins, to have their cells, to be living, that nitrogen has to be what's called fixed. So we're going to fix atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form. And that's the whole point of the nitrogen cycle. So this is under number 3 on your notes organizer. The nitrogen cycle itself is the movement of nitrogen throughout the Earth and throughout the Earth's atmosphere. There are 4 main processes: nitrogen fixation, digestion, decomposition or denitrification, you'll hear it both ways, and then elimination, which is simply animal waste. Okay, so let's start by talking about nitrogen fixation. So this is that process of fixing nitrogen, capturing and converting the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere into a form that can be used by living things like plants and animals. So there are three ways that this can happen. You have these bacteria that are capable of nitrogen fixation. They're called nitrogen fixing bacteria. You have lightning that can fix bacteria into a usable form. And then we actually do have human factories that are capable of doing this. Unfortunately, that's very expensive. That takes a lot of energy. That can put carbon dioxide back into the environment, which we know can be bad. So we're mostly going to focus talking about nitrogen-fixing bacteria and lightning. Okay, so the first nitrogen-fixing method is going to be lightning. Lightning, of course, is very high energy. The high energy that exists in lightning when lightning strikes is actually capable of breaking apart those nitrogen molecules that are bonded together in the air. Remember, they exist as two nitrogen atoms bonded together. So the rain then carries those free nitrogen atoms down to the soil, where it can then be used by plants or absorbed or consumed by animals, whatever you're talking about. But lightning is capable of fixing nitrogen into a usable form by breaking those nitrogen atoms apart that are found in the atmosphere. The rain carries down the usable nitrogen. Okay, now we're going to talk about nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So these different species of bacteria are capable of fixing that atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form. Some of that nitrogen-fixing bacteria is just found free in the soil, but there are also nitrogen-fixing bacteria that exist in symbiotic relationships with plants. Remember when we talked about symbiosis? It's a long-term relationship between two different species. So some plants that have these nitrogen-fixing nodules, these little lumps here, they're full of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. That's like alfalfa, legumes like beans, peas, corn, clover, and soy. So sometimes farmers will put these plants that have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria into rotation in their crops so that they can actually return large amounts of nitrogen to the soil. And then they'll grow something different. The next year it's nice, good fertilizer, and the next generation of plants will grow really well. Okay, so tell me what type of symbiosis this relationship is. Remember, you have mutualism, commensalism, or parasitism. So the nitrogen-fixing bacteria are getting the nutrients that they need from the plant that absorbs it in through their roots, and then the plants are getting this nice, usable form of nitrogen from the bacteria. So both are benefiting. What type of relationship would that be? Mutualism, of course. This is 3G on your notes organizer. Okay, so the other parts of the nitrogen cycle: digestion, elimination, and decomposition or denitrification. So digestion, of course, is when the animals consume the plants that are full of that already fixed nitrogen that existed in the nitrogen-fixing bacteria nodules. Elimination is going to be when you have animal waste, poop, and the wastes are loaded with nitrogen that then returns to the soil. And this is what farmers use as fertilizer. When you hear them saying that they're using manure as a fertilizer, it's because it's full of all of that already fixed nitrogen. And then decomposition or denitrification, remember you had nitrogen fixing, which was breaking down the nitrogen into a usable form. Decomposition, done by decomposers like bacteria, they undo that process and they put it back into the atmosphere. So denitrification is the process of breaking down nitrogen that was usable and returning it to the nitrogen to the soil and then eventually to the atmosphere. Okay, so I want you to pause here, or you can go back to one of the other slides if you liked another picture better, and I want you to draw a simple nitrogen cycle, either down under 3H or on the space in the back. Okay, last up we have the carbon cycle, and this should be a big review from what we did first semester when we talked about photosynthesis and cell respiration. So real quickly, let's review what is the purpose of photosynthesis. The purpose of photosynthesis is to use energy from the sun in order to make food for the plants. Where does that take place? We should all know what organelle. Of course, it takes place in the chloroplast. So that's producers. They're capable of photosynthesis. What is the purpose of cellular respiration? So if photosynthesis was taking energy and using it to make food, the purpose of cellular respiration is taking food, glucose, and breaking it down in order to form energy in the form of ATP. So food into energy, that's the purpose of cellular respiration. Where does that take place? In eukaryotic organisms, that takes place in the mitochondria. Okay, so now that we've reviewed photosynthesis and cellular respiration, the carbon cycle is of course the series of processes through which all carbon atoms rotate. So how does carbon exist? In what forms can you actually find carbon? Of course, we have the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You have that, we're breathing out every time we respire. You have rocks that have carbon in it. That's like limestone, for example. You have dead organic matter. And then you have fossil fuels, these deposits of coal, petroleum, and natural gas. So that is 4D on your notes organizer. So how does carbon enter into the living organisms? How does it enter into the biotic environment? This is through photosynthesis. Producers are the key to the carbon cycle. So once the photosynthesizers take in the carbon returns to the atmosphere through respiration, decomposition, and then the burning of fossil fuels, the combustion of fossil fuels. So how do humans have an impact on the carbon cycle? Well, every time we have deforestation, you are removing photosynthesizers, so that of course has a huge impact. And then every time we burn or combust a fossil fuel, we're also having a huge impact on the carbon cycle. Okay, so here's a quick summary. I think this is on 4H on your notes organizer. Carbon is brought in through photosynthesis. And this is a very simple, picture made for kids. You can read that yourself. Animals and plants then return the carbon during respiration. Those plants and animals die and can eventually become what's called a fossil fuel, where they compact over time. And that's like gasoline, oil, and coal. Those fossil fuels, when burned, return that carbon to the atmosphere. Okay, so what's the big deal about the burning of fossil fuels? We all hear about global warming and how burning fossil fuels is bad. Why is that? The atmosphere and the Earth itself needs a very delicate balance of all these different gases. So the problem is that by burning fossil fuels, we're actually putting too much of that carbon back into the atmosphere. Because normally those fossil fuels would eventually break down over time due to weathering, but we're increasing the rate that those carbon molecules are breaking down and going back into the atmosphere. So we're putting all this carbon back into the atmosphere, which is causing an increase in the amount of heat that is being trapped from the sun, and that creates what's called the greenhouse effect. Think about what you know about greenhouses. They're nice and warm, right? They're trapping a whole bunch of sunlight energy. So by trapping all this heat energy within our atmosphere, it's thought that we're actually heating up our entire planet. This is what's called global warming. You've all heard this before. And by heating up our entire planet, we're affecting the types of weather that we're having here on Earth. So we're having all this different types of weather that we didn't used to have in the past, and it's all thought that it's because we're putting too much carbon back into the atmosphere. Okay, so you can pause here on the picture of the carbon cycle or go back to one of the other slides if you liked another picture better, and either use the space under 4J to draw a simple picture or use the space on this back page. That's pretty much it for the cycling of matter. I hope this helped. I also put some tutorials on the blog if you're still a little bit confused or if you need some extra review over any of the cycles. Have a great night.